Okay, so welcome to the Node.js Next 10 mini summit for November 18th, 2021. We're going to talk about types and generating exes. We have the agenda, which is tagged in the issue, as well, which was issue number 99 in the Next 10 repo. We also have a minutes doc, which is in the issue. I posted it so if people want to follow on there. We have two topics. So we've got the schedule, which is suitable types for end users, and the second topic, which is single executable applications. I thought it would make sense for us all to just do a mini roundtable just to introduce who we are and what our interest is, so that we know who everybody is, and then we can dive into that. So maybe if it's okay, I'll call on people in the order that I see them in my screen, and we can go with that. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, I see a few thumbs up and some nods, so great. Okay, so first, and I'm going to apologize in advance in that I'm terrible with names and pronunciation. So if I butcher your name, sorry in advance. Feel free to correct me. So first of all, Orta.
There we go. Hey, everybody. I work on the TypeScript team, so I work at Microsoft. I'm also sort of one of the people that's done a lot of the process work on Definitely Typed that has sort of allowed it to scale to the amount of contributors that it has. I obviously care about what the types for Node are because we use Node everywhere, and have a good sense of like kind of what the TypeScript team wants out of Node types as well as what users want. Though I don't maintain the node types, I've obviously sent a few PRs their way to sort of help make it better for different reasons as TypeScript changes.
Okay, thanks. Michael Zasso.
Yes, hello. So I'm a member of the Node TSC, and I'm mostly interested in the types part of the meeting because I use them a lot at work, and I'd like to know what we can do in core to help type users.
Great, thanks. Next is Tierney.
Hey, Tierney Siren, I developer advocate at Microsoft. I do a bunch of things around the project. I've been trying to do a lot of docs improvements recently, or as many as I can. Yeah, I'm interested in both types. I have an ideal world of how that gets done, and understanding that that's probably not the reality of how it happens. But yeah, so I'm interested in types. I'm also very interested in the single binary. I think that's something that we need, and I very much want to see that happen. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. Joe, you're next.
Hey, Joey.
Are you asking me or sorry?
Oh, sorry, I said Joe, but
Either way, fine.
It sounds similar. Yeah.
I oftentimes like at the coffee shop, they'll ask my name and I'll say Joe and they'll say Jill. Yeah, I'm Joe Seppi. I am Open Tech Program Director at IBM and have been in the Node space for a while, and currently one of the two representatives at the OpenJS Foundation, which is where I spend some of my time as well. Yeah, and just curious about both these topics.
Okay, Max.
Hey, my name is Max. I'm a software engineer working at Microsoft in the Playwright team. And yeah, something about Playwright. It's a browser automation library for Chromium, WebKit, and Firefox. And yeah, there we provide also cross-language support for Python, Java, and .NET via something called a driver, which is .NET with a little bit of wiring and so on. And I'm interested in this single executable topic.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Eric, you're next.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Eric Romendo. I'm from Brazil. I work with training courses about Node.js and a lot of community stuff, and recently working for NodeSource as a performance engineer. So I'm looking forward for this event. Super amazing to be back with you guys.
Sounds good. Jarish.
Hello, everybody. I'm Girish. I work for IBM. I am active in Node.js Core, TSC, as well as in the diagnostics working group. I also help end users through the help repo. My general interest in the project is the long-term sustenance and success of the project, plus diagnostics and tooling, and having great user experience for the end users. So that's my general interest. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Oops, people are moving around on me now. Joy, I think you're next.
Hi, I'm Joy. I am a member of the TSC. I work in Node.js mostly on snapshots these days. Also, I work on language features, sometimes in the
Okay, thanks. As people join, it's moving around, so I'm doing my best to make sure I don't miss anybody. But Igor, I think you'd be next.
Yeah, thanks. I work for Versal, and I'm the original maintainer of PKG, the tool that makes the binary. So I'm curious about the second part, about the executables, and I feel I may have something to say and useful with it. Thanks.
Definitely, thanks for coming. I guess Richard Lau.
Hi, I'm Richard. I work at Red Hat. I'm the newest member of the Node TSC. I also work in the build and release working groups. And yeah, I'm here to sort of trying to keep abreast of these issues.
Okay, thank you. Ruben.
Hey, I'm also a member of the TSC, and I work for a German company called Wolf. I mainly maintain a couple of areas in Node.js that not so many other people have looked at before, like assert and console and util things. Yeah, I'm curious about today. Looking forward to what we are going to discuss.
Sounds good. Beth?
Michael, sorry to interrupt. Oh, you got it. Never mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Beth. Sorry. And
hi, everyone. My name is Beth Griggs. I work at Red Hat, particularly active in the Node.js project on the TSC, but mostly doing a lot of the release work and creative releases.
okay, so I'm just going through. I think Stifle is. If I know you've just joined, but we're going through kind of doing a short introduction. If you'd like to do that.
Sure. Yeah, I work at Vercel, and we have several different tools that might pertain to this summit. We have NCC, PKG, we also have NFT, and so we're really interested in Node.js and packaging and just moving the ecosystem forward.
Sounds good, thanks. And I think Simon.
Morning. Yeah, I'm primarily interested in the suitable types for end users, since I've maintained the node types for quite a long time as a side project. So curious to see where that goes.
Okay, thanks. Is there anybody that I've missed at this point? If not, I'll go last. I'm Michael Dawson, member of the TSC as well, and helping to sort of guide, basically working with the Next 10 team to look at what's important for the future of Node.js. We've come up with a number of topics, which is two of the topics are the subject of the mini summit today. And so, yeah, so I'm involved in the Node project in a bunch of different places, also work at Red Hat along with a few of the other people who are here as well. So thanks for everybody for coming and for those introductions. I think at this point we can dive into the particular sections. We have breaks set for, between the 90-minute sessions. If we do need another small break or whatever, make sure people put up their hands. I'm going to start a timer just as a reminder that, if we hit the sort of, say, maybe 60-minute mark or whatever, we can take an assessment there of what's going on. So I'm going to set that to 60 minutes to start, and then we can figure out where we go from there. So maybe I'll just frame, what I thought we'd cover in the suitable type section, and people, it would be great if other people would fill in, round that out, make sure we don't have things, from my perspective, I think from our discussions in the next 10, there's sort of general consensus that types are important. Not all developers like them, of course. Some developers don't want to use types, some do, but there's a big enough portion that it's an important thing that we want to make sure Node developers can effectively use types. And my personal goal out of this is that we as a project understand, how good a shape are we in terms of types for Node.js? Is everything going perfectly? We've got a great process. We don't need to do anything at all because everything's just ticking along and we get the types that we need. Or are there some things that, like within the project, that we could consider doing that would help make that process better? And so it's to come out of that with do we have some action items, or can we confidently say that, nope, on this particular topic, which we've identified as important, we're good? Do people have thoughts, additions to that? I think, I'm sure some people have some thoughts there.
I can start. From the TypeScript team's perspective, generally speaking, like having the types indefinitely typed give us quite a lot of advantages that if they were shipped with Node would not necessarily exist, like easy typo fixes or upstream or like quick changes by the community, as well as sort of documentation that might be overly verbose inside types that don't necessarily need to then be overly verbose in the same way inside like the actual core documentation. But I think there is some arguments that there are ways in which maybe automation can improve the way that like the types that are generated and put into DT could be improved. I think Simon has something that actually extracts documentation from Node. I've seen him make PRs that look automated in some sense, but I'm not quite sure what the process behind that is.
Yeah, I can give some info on that. Effectively, the tool I wrote tries to match our existing types to the JSON documentation that is generated and hosted on the official Node.js website, and kind of tries to pull them in, because the primary goal behind this was to kind of improve the user experience there and avoid them having to switch between the official Node docs and the TypeScript docs, because we already had some documentation pulled in there that includes the @since tag versions and so on. This is fairly incomplete. I didn't have a lot of time to work on this, and but this is one of the things I worked on. This is by far not a manual process. That would have been insane.
So just for my benefit, it basically takes the docs that we generate and then generates some of the documentation or the types, or both, that go into the definitely typed.
No. So
okay, that was a good question.
This was strictly pulling in doc tags. However, it also has some side effects where it will tell me, hey, this method is documented, but the types do not exist, and vice versa. So it was a little bit of a quality tool and generally to improve documentation. Yeah.
An interesting sort of analogy here, it could be to how the types work for the web, the DOM types effectively. What we have over there is first of all, webs all have specifications, and we work with those specifications and sort of auto generate types from that. But after that, we sort of reach into the Mozilla sort of documentation repos, and they have these big JSON dumps of all the different bits of documentation, and we just sort of extract out the useful bits of documentation that you would want in line, and then effectively allow the code gen to sort of come from a standardized system, and then we extract extra documentation from like known good documentation sources and append those to the types. And so maybe there's an argument that like the sort of thing that Simon has built already, maybe there is a good like, here's a JSON dump of the functions that exist inside Node, and like we have a process where we can like extract that, use that JSON dump to then provide better comments and sort of richer richer types inside the actual type system in DT.
And this gets kind of into the weeds, or you're closer to what my ideal is for how we do this, which is effectively mimicking Electron. Are you familiar with Electron's tooling around this sort of?
Lightly, but only from you and me talking, so it's probably worth it.
Yeah. So Electron has a tool called docs parser. This tool, here, I'll put a link. It's not particularly descriptive in the README, but this tool parses their documentation. So they have a markdown documentation structure that's relatively structured after Node's documentation structure. They parse out the documentation and basically convert markdown into an AST that represents like a markdown AST that represents the API surface area, and then they do the same thing that we do, which they have a JSON representation of the API, and then they can generate types based off of that. So basically what you're saying, the difference between theirs and ours is we kind of just dump everything into like a text property, but theirs is like correct JSON representation of every API with descriptions and all of that. The ideal, I'm happy to hear that the direction y'all think would be good would be having some kind of JSON representation of our API surface area, and then building off of that, because we're not too far off of that. Or I mean, that's part of what I would like to see too. I don't know if we are too far off of that or not. And frankly, I've spent some time working on getting docs parser to work with Node. It doesn't right now. So that it's not something that we could just kind of use. The API surface area between Node and Electron are very different. Node has a lot more legacy grossness than Electron does. They've been very strict with their API. So yeah, I think I agree that having that JSON representation of the API would be lovely. And I think however we get to that that's probably a really good spot to be, just for the project in general. But whether that's through parsing our docs and outputting it, or whether that's from somehow getting that, or somehow dumping it and then building docs and types off that, I don't know. But I think that's a good seed that I hadn't been thinking of as a starting point.
Yeah, one of the things that's a little bit of a tension is that the deeper that the integration lies on your side, in the sense of Node side versus DT side, is that you have to, like, the maintainers have to know more about sort of the internal Z library style writing of TypeScript, right? Like when people start adopting TypeScript, the first things they do is they write a few apps and they put types in a few different places, and that's usually enough. You get a bit bigger, and then suddenly you start realizing there's all this advanced syntax that you've never even heard of, like template literal syntax that goes across mapped types that do conditionals. All this stuff exists basically at the for definitely typed. For people trying to type really pretty complicated to type JavaScript because JavaScript is so dynamic. And ideally, node contributors, when trying to document, don't need to know all of these sort of like more complicated ways to type dynamic JavaScript, and that gets put on the Simon Schicks of the world, who know how to handle the problems of having multiple globals in the same namespace, or how to handle the problems of conditional types and things like that. So that's why I think a good match is that, like, leaving DT to handle a lot of the sort of complicated typesy stuff, but making it easy for the complicated typesy stuff on DT to be able to get to know that they're missing a function for a particular version of Node, to be able to extract useful markdown metadata. And if you have stuff like examples of the usage of that API, being able to extract that out of that metadata as well, that just makes really great doc comments.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess that kind of changes it to a question for the node people here. Do we have any way to get a JSON representation of our our surface area at all, or no?
I mean, today I don't think so, right? Like, okay. So it's what I'm thinking is, like, would it make sense for us to map out like our ideal world, and maybe write that down in a few words what that looks like, which we've talked about a little bit, and then go into like how would we get there, right? Because I think for me it's useful just to know where would we like to be, even if it's impossible, right? But like that gives you a good sort of frame of what everybody thinks would be a good thing to work towards, and then we could figure out, does that make sense to people? So what would the flow, like, if we could, I'm going to write this in the note, ideal flow. So what do we think the ideal flow would be? I think this starts with, and it sounds like, API is added / documented in, maybe it's API, I guess those go together. API is added documented in Node.js code base, right? What's the next thing that happens in our ideal flow? A maintainer, collaborators, just add that. What do we go from there?
Simon, do you have any opinions on this? Like, you're one of the people that like mostly involved on our side. I'd love you to feel comfortable.
So I mean, let's go from what we already have, right? So right now, as I mentioned, there is the JSON version of the Node.js documentation, which we're currently going off. I think the flow overall would be very similar. There would need to be some improvements made, primarily around the accuracy of the documentation, like the precision of the documentation, such as specific overloads, return types, generics, and so on. Yeah, so this is kind of that. So I think the overall mechanism that already exists is pretty good, because all of these documentation, all of these JSON blobs are downloadable directly by everyone and can easily be integrated in our tooling, which is what I did. The primary thing that really needs to be improved is the structure of the docs. As I said, the detail that is in those docs, and sometimes also the structure. If I may, like the primary struggle that I had.
Could I just, sorry. Could we just write down, like, I'm not familiar enough with the flow to get into the details quite yet. So we could step back to, like, you said there's already a JSON representation. Where does that come from? What generates that? Is that your tool? Is it something
ours.
Else?
Okay, so it's the JSON docs output.
Okay, so we have API. A job that okay, so Node.js, and is that do we do that as part of our builds or just part of our regular doc generation?
We output it as part of the build. It is basically just pulling like literally raw text and a couple meta pieces of information, like the version changes and stuff. but it's a lot of raw text.
Okay, so where does that go? Like, is it?
It's like it's literally any path you just add .json rather than .html on the doc site.
Okay. So Node.js builds, puts into JSON, published as, so I'm going to say, so maybe this is Node.js publishes JSON content on doc site. And I just add .json because I wasn't aware of that. So, okay, add .json to end of URL. Is that accurate, what I just wrote?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
I'm just going to try that out so that I understand here. Node.js API docs. So I'm just going to go to 17. Right. That didn't go. So async buffer, say. Go to the method. So if I just add JSON. Come on. I don't think that gave me anything. Nope.
There have been a couple links posted in the chat.
Okay, thanks. That's perfect. I will. Could somebody promote Paris while I'm doing that?
Joe, that has to be you. I don't think I'm.
I've tried to do it a few times. They've declined. So.
Okay, that's fine. If they don't want to. If they don't want to do that, so I just wanted to make sure they had the option. Okay. Okay, so we got that example. Okay, so we have an existing process which basically published JSON. Okay, and then so the next step after that, Simon, is that your tool runs on that JSON?
Yeah, so effectively the tool tries to match the tree, like the documentation trees together, like of what we already have in TypeScript, as in the individual module declarations, globals, libraries, classes, and everything that is nested. Kind of like tries to match these trees together, and then pulls out the information out of the Node.js documentation. And by doing that, it compares the trees, like what entries are missing on either side. So for example, do we have methods documented that are not in the official Node.js docs? Maybe they have been deprecated, maybe they've been removed, etc., etc. And pulls out like various tags, such as again the since tags. It pulls out one of my versions also had some type checking, where it was checking the arguments against each other. It was checking that the arguments have the same name, etc. So not like super deep stuff, and it was not necessarily generating individual docs based on that. It was more like outputting warnings to the user. Yeah, so that's kind of what that does.
Okay, so in today's flow, we publish the stuff, your tool runs, it'll generate a bunch of warnings saying, hey, these things are missing or don't look aligned anymore. Do you then manually take that and create PRs?
Right now running this tool is a fairly manual process. The tool will actively like inline all of the documentation that I mentioned. However, it will not automatically create new method signatures or any signatures really. I was looking into that, but haven't had the time, unfortunately.
So it will actively inline new, like it can pull out some of the doc, and it'll, if it's for an existing method, it automatically incorporates, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it will pull out the documentation and generate a bunch of doc strings.
Okay. Well, doc for methods where there is a match and update the docs. New methods require manual work. Do you run? So do you run that manually, or do you have it a job that runs, or how does that kind of work?
I don't think this is currently integrated in any sort of CI. Adding scripts to or to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think adding scripts from specific type subdirectories is not generally something that is done. However, I could see if we refine these scripts quite a bit, that adding them specifically for the Node.js typings would be feasible. I don't think that there's anything that would specifically block that. It's just not really done right now.
Yeah. I think it's a good idea. I've been thinking about that the entire way through this discussion. Like, oh yeah, we could get that in the CI. That would be a really good idea. So we could do it on TP side.
Because right now the tool is not, frankly, user friendly enough to really do that. Definitely have to make some improvements there, but I would actually want to rewrite the entire thing because it's rather crude.
Right. Okay. So I kind of documented this as opposed to the ideal flow. The current flow is we add stuff to the documentation. We publish it in the JSON content. You then will run your tool manually at some point. It tries to do the matching. You probably do like a manual review of what's actively pulled in, as well as creating maybe additional PRs for like additional new types and stuff like that, or new APIs.
Yeah. So
yeah. Sorry, everything has to go through API.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. So generally, at least the way I have approached it, and some others have approached it, the general contributions to Node.js have always been version based. Like Node.js released a new version, say, I don't know, 16.9, because I haven't gotten around to do 17. And I usually look at all of the changes that were included in that release and try to apply them. This is a fairly manual process, though.
Okay. So that's like the current flow. Now, I don't know if it's worthwhile to discuss like going back now to some of the challenges with that, or trying to say what would our ideal flow be? What do people think would be the best thing to talk about next?
Maybe ideal, but I feel like this keeps moving stuff to our side, which is like we take that script, we find a way to improve it.
Right. So, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
So 17 comes out, whenever 17 was first released, we know to be able to run one thing that tells us these are the things that are missing. These are the documentation changes that have happened since then, and that can either become like a GitHub issue on DT, or it can be the next time somebody tries to do an update in the PR, the CI says, hey, you're missing this entire thing. We just have to trust that script enough, which means we have to trust the data enough.
Right. So, okay. So maybe it's pretty simple. It's just automated script runs, generates new PR. And I guess PRs. I don't know how much that helps, but because that's probably the ideal. Always basically some automated script. If we could automate, the better, right? I don't know if people can see what I've written there in the ideal flow. Is there useful things we can add to that based on in terms of discussion? Or
I'm sorry, the document you're typing in, is that shared? Sorry, I joined this meeting a bit late.
Yep, sorry, here, I'll repaste it in the chat.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I mean that's like the super optimistic one where we
have
checking and everything perfectly in sync, and all it requires is a human manual review in that PR.
Yeah.
We're talking of an ideal end goal, and that's a pretty ideal end goal.
And I think the interesting, like, part of the key thing is, like, you were saying, like, hey, there's advantages to having it in DT versus in Node. And so, like, this would capture, like, we don't think we should pull it into Node, right? Like, this captures, like, the ideal flow is we generate some sort of machine readable documentation or artifact, which then DT could consume, or if there was some other sort of type system or tools could consume. And at least for me, that actually is a nice split in terms of, we're not, the project, like you said, we're not necessarily worrying about any particular type system, but we're generating the artifact that can help any of those type systems be effective for us, right? And so I think it's a good time to ask anybody who's here, like, does that model fit your preference, understanding, what you think is the ideal flow? Because that's a good thing just to agree on that in the first place.
It definitely fits mine, but I'd also like to hear from some of the other node folks.
Sounds good to me.
And I guess in our typical, like, silence is assumed to be no objection. So if it sounds to me like everybody here is pretty much on board with that, that's makes sense to the people we've got here, which is a good start. Okay, so if we go based on that ideal flow, then I think, like you said, some of the stuff like the automation on the DT side and all that, yeah, that's maybe optimistic, but for these discussions, that may not matter so much. It's more what can we do in terms of that machine consumable code base to make it as easy as possible for, the scripts you have today or future automation to be able to consume that data. So maybe that's where it's worth, like, in this forum, worth discussing, we generate something today, but I'm guessing from some of the discussion, it's not ideal. What concrete things would we identify or whatever where we could improve on that front? Does that make sense to people?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we could, like, I don't know the best way to go into that. You were listing some challenges, so maybe I didn't want to cut you off on that because that's really interesting. Maybe this is the right time to go back for you to kind of go over some of the challenges now that there is with the existing flow. Does that make sense?
Sure. So the current JSON documentation is often fairly inaccurate. The documentation itself, like the written words, are fairly accurate. However, the structure is often wrong. I have a link that should demonstrate this. It's a little bit code heavy, but basically this function tries to realign the two trees, which was also a fair, like the two documentation trees, or like rather trying to match our tree to the TypeScript definition tree to the Node.js documentation tree. And often things are incorrectly nested. The module names don't match. Like, things are not where they're supposed to be. Things are missing. Things are double, triple nested for some reason. So generally, it's been very hard. Generally, a lot of the time, the generated JSON docs do not represent the actual API surface. If that makes sense. Like, sometimes things are marked as objects and they're in fact classes, or they're classes and then they have subclasses. There's a bunch of structural issues. The link I just posted includes, I believe, most of them. So this is the primary challenge. As I said, the structure is incorrect a lot of the times. And
sorry, you posted a link to okay, so that's the generated doc, is it? Or
no, this is not very idiomatic code, hence needs a little bit of cleanup. But this method basically takes in the JSON document that the tool downloads and transforms it and tries to align it more closer to the tree structure of the TypeScript definitions.
Right. Did you have an example of, like, a link for a JSON file that would be a good one to look at and say, oh, that's like the structure that didn't match what the doc should be, like, from
You would have to give me a little bit to specifically point one out, because these these files are also fairly large. So actually looking at them is not very useful, I'm afraid.
Because just this, like that script's a bit, I'm not sure if I can't consume it immediately, but the like an example of like, hey, here's the JSON doc that's doing the wrong thing might be a bit easier, but.
Yeah, it's a little bit much to take in. Trust me, don't like it very much either. But it's gives you an idea of the amount of mismatches that are there.
Right. So sorry. Yeah. Okay. So that's the major problem.
This is like this just makes it a little bit difficult to match types together. The other one is like the accuracy or the detail of some of the documentation. So for example, and let me think. To give you a more explicit example, how do we, for example, model in this new JSON structure that we're potentially proposing? How do we model complex generics overload? For example, you're probably familiar with the fact that certain methods, if you pass in an option big and true, they, instead of returning something that contains a number, or it starts returning big-ins instead. Like these type of things, how do we model those? And currently these are not modeled at all. Like most of the documentation just assumes that these functions always return like type unions, which is not very accurate. So that's also one thing. Sorry if I'm digressing a little bit. I didn't have a whole lot of sleep. Another major thing that has been that required a lot of manual labor is, say you have the methods in, for example, the child process module. A lot of these methods use very, very similar data structures, but each method kind of documents them the same. Like there's no overarching types that are declared for, okay, all of these methods take this type, but most of them just redeclare all of the properties, which leads to a lot of duplication. And in the TypeScript definitions, we've been making an effort to kind of streamline them and see, okay, so these two methods have exactly the same properties for the first argument, so we're matching these together, and we create this interface definition just to avoid massive amounts of duplication. So this is also one thing that is currently not done. Like there's no virtual types or interface declarations or object declarations, whatever you want to call them, which makes this a little bit difficult. Specifically because right now I try to match the interface declarations that we currently have in the TypeScript definitions to method signatures, but this was not really doable because, again, they don't really exist. Is that making sense?
I think I'm understanding, like we don't have like a section up front or something that says, here's some types that are used across methods. Each one is documented as its own thing, right?
Yes. It's very duplication heavy and not really like taken out of the flow. It's just you're really only documenting function arguments, members, and so on. There's like no documentation for these type of I don't know what you call them, DTOs or whatever.
You mean say DTOs? What did you mean by that?
I'm not really sure what to call these, like, but basically, I think you understand me correctly.
Okay. Right. Okay, so I'm just digesting. So I guess, Tierney, do any of those challenges overlap with the challenges you've had using the Electron
I mean,
type parser, or?
I mean, Electron does also, so part of docs parser is having some of those structures defined up front, and that they basically get applied. Like how docs parser is written is basically a way to textually document TypeScript APIs, or APIs in TypeScript with Markdown, in a way that's very human readable and very, it looks like docs. Like you're just writing docs, but you write it in a specific way that kind of solves, like, all of these problems are solved with Electron's docs parser. So yes, I think that's answering your question.
And it would require, I guess, fairly substantial changes to the existing docs, right?
Yeah. I think I've shared that link before, but I did some examples, some example conversions. I think the primary challenges are one, updating docs parser. It honestly would probably need a full rewrite. Starting from scratch is a better solution, I think, than using docs parser directly, unless someone wants to spend, the time to update it. But yeah.
Well, help me understand that part. Like,
uh-huh.
why would writing something new versus reusing?
Electron's API is very different than ours, and it would require substantial kind of bolting on to get our API to be able to be represented. We also have some use cases that are rather weird that I think are kind of what Simon is touching on here, of like the a method can just change, like what you pass to a method is not consistent, which is very much not it's not very type friendly, is, I guess, the way to put it, which makes writing docs that can convert to types very hard. So we would also have to bolt on like switching for that somehow, and it's possible, but
the API style is
sorry,
different enough that it's not. Sorry, go ahead.
I have to interrupt. I have a very important thing at work that just popped up. I will come back as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay,
cool.
Thanks
you,
for the
Simon.
heads up. Yeah. So I guess, Tierney, you're saying our API style is different enough that, yeah, it's what's there in Electron really isn't a good fit at all.
It's a fit, but I think it's a good thing to take inspiration from. It's not something to directly use. Is the way I'd approach that. We can take a lot of inspiration from it. I think directly using it will be just as much work to directly use it as it will be to write something from scratch that is a little bit more tuned to our needs. So basically take the concepts, but not the implementation.
Right. And we have an existing parser, obviously, that creates our JSON format, right?
I don't think that kind of, I think it's part of the Markdown conversion process, and it outputs the nodes. I could be wrong on that, but my understanding is that it outputs nodes from the built Markdown, which is partially why it's kind of gross. I could be off on that though.
Okay, so it wasn't. It's maybe a side effect of our flow versus a planned. Hey, we're gonna.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is very much something that we have accidentally built out without a lot of thinking about it as an actual API people would use.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, like an easy win there is like Markdown as well as HTML in there, because you write JS docs in Markdown.
Yeah, I think I've talked a bit with one person, and honestly, what I would recommend here is we work on something with types folks, and basically try to make sure we're addressing their needs, but go one doc at a time, and basically build the output from like query string first, for example, and then go to the next doc and make sure that one will work too, and kind of will address the use cases as we build it out. rather than trying to make something that fixes all our docs at once. That's a really tall order that I don't think is possible. But
Yeah.
the other benefit of this is the other benefit of that tooling is that it helps it does give that API that can be used in a lot of other places, and it also makes your markdown more consistent. It makes you have to write markdown a specific way, which ends up reading a lot better, which is a huge win. And there's also certain things you can do, like you can require code examples and fail or like output all of the things that don't have code examples, which to Orda's point earlier, giving code examples is actually really good for types because you can give that in the type definitions, and I think definitions, and give that surface set to end users, and then we could split that out into output. And it's a lot of things, a lot of markdown ASDs, but yeah.
I don't know if we could make that more concrete by looking at one of our examples. Does that make any sense to pull up like maybe a simpler one and see what that might, look like?
I mean, I have, so obviously, caveat that I'm recommending that we don't directly use Electron's tool, but instead kind of start working a bit on our own. But I have an example of, I've converted some of our docs to work with Markdown or with Electron's docs parser. So let's see, node docs parser. So I'm just pulling up the repo. I've put the repo in the chat. So if you look at docs/API/query string in that query string.md, that is like effectively what the query string API would look like in a docs parserified output. And the originals folder there has kind of the original source for the query string API. So you can kind of side by side that.
Does it make sense to share that and just do that?
Yeah, I can. Here, let me do this. Let me help here real quick. Let's see here. Let's see here. I'm going to share VS Code. How do I screen share in there? God, it's been a while since I've actually used Zoom. There you go. So that, and then you pull up the other one. Go. Yeah, so I mean, like they're very similar APIs, right? Like the actual output looks relatively similar. I think we start seeing some differences here. Oh no, I opened the original one.
They look identical.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was not different. Okay, so it's generally when we get to this, so you can see, let's see, parse. Where's parse? No, that's new.
There may be in backwards.
It can only render one at a time, and it updates the other one. Well, we can look at the raw markdown then.
Yeah.
Which I guess is probably a little bit better. So one thing I did have to do is there is no syntax in docs parser for these the introduced in, so that I stripped all that out. We would want to reintroduce that as a specific syntax, but we would want it to be raw markdown still, so not HTML comments.
Okay,
What's
so
the
that's
bound?
I'm just going to take that as a note. So it's basically like the information, info in comments would need to be converted to markdown, raw markdown.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's for example, introduced.
Yeah.
Okay.
We apparently even have two different concepts of versions. We have introduced and added. One is YAML and one is random. But this is the kind of stuff I mean about Node, is like we have these varied
I think
approaches.
YAML is the one that we really use now.
Yeah.
I don't know the other ones.
So one of the benefits of how Electron does it is it structures it into you have to structure in like your methods, and there's a few different structures that they follow. I'm not recalling them off the top of my head, but this is one example of, you move everything into a methods heading
Section. Yep.
that then can get parsed into, like, that allows you to kind of parse it correctly out into these are methods on query string.
Right.
And that kind of helps with some of the type stuff, which is really nice. Let's see here. I'm trying to, this one was particularly challenging. So yeah, this is the most simple example that I did in this, and I wanted to bring that one up intentionally. It's not substantially different. And that's the nice thing about it.
Right.
In some of our more complicated ones, it is a bit different, and I can get into that too if you'd like. But
yeah, maybe so that's actually a perfect example. Like, it shows like, okay, we need some more structure so that you can say everything in this section are methods, right? And that is there another sort of next level example that
I think V8 was particularly annoying, but let me double check to make sure here. Yeah. So it V8 starts getting into classes. I will just do the same here. I will not change the file names. So this is the new V8 one, and this is the old V8 one. And feel free to follow along in the actual link that I pasted. But you can see here, this one is specifically where we start getting into some differences between how Electron and Node does it, or how we do things differently. So you can see this is a 400 line doc. 400 line doc. So you can see we have methods still, but we also get into classes. So you also have classes. So there's serializer, and I believe there's deserializer. And you have, for under classes, you have their own structures as well. So instance methods and a few others. I know there's some other things that fall under this as well. But yeah, class deserializer, instance methods on the deserializer class. So you start building out that same kind of structure for all of your classes as well. So yeah, that's a little bit more complicated example.
But I mean, everybody else on this call sanity check me, but that doesn't seem terribly like, if you wanted to sit down, if I wanted to sit down and say, how do I transfer one to the other, that I'm still pretty easily to understand, right? Like we'd have to document that says, like, if you're documenting a class, you use these headings. But it seems like something that could be fairly easily documented, and people could help. We, crowdsource moving things over would actually be possible.
Yeah, and to kind of expand on that, I just linked the style guide that Electron bases. That it basically does exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
Which again, it's not a lot. Like there's not a lot there. Now, the programming side of it is implementing this of parsing Markdown and extracting this into JSON is a little bit of work, but it's not an obscene amount of work. It's also not trivial. So
it's a known.
Yeah. But yeah, it's I mean, I think if you go to that link, the Electron style guide, which I guess I could just share this.
Yeah.
That specifically, let me do this one. This kind of gives a pretty good example of the outline of how Electron does it. There are a few things that are different in Node that I won't get into right now, but one of the big things is multiple classes, which Electron does not do. They only do one class per module. But yeah, like basically, you're parsing this kind of markdown into a JSON API representation. The other thing that benefits, to your point earlier, Michael, about the project and kind of being agnostic of TypeScript, the other thing that Electron does with this is they have automation around it in the repo. So when, say, I go and make a change to, I don't know, FS, I make a change to FS, I can see that they have a bot that basically checks to see, okay, cool, has this method been updated? Have the docs been updated? No. And then you can kind of make sure to push people towards updating docs in addition to the APIs that they're representing, which is very useful in making sure that docs are synced and therefore types are synced. So we don't get into a situation where, it's harder to keep the types updated over the long term, since they can just kind of be generated automatically from people pushing changes when they're happening.
Right, makes sense. So my next question would be, like, can you just show us an example where, like, we couldn't follow the Electron style guide and have it just work? Because writing a whole new tool is a much higher bar than saying, hey, we've got a tool and we've got a definition of a style guide.
Yep.
Are we okay with moving stuff over?
I think so. I think specifically this is some of the APIs that are older are particularly hard. I think VM was one. I'm just trying to look over them real quick before I dig into that. I think VM is one example. Oh, Net is Net has some wonky stuff that is not, I think, what people would consider modern. Particularly the I'm trying to find it. Some of the parameters can change. You can pass in different parameters to the same method and get different results, which is hard. That's something Electron explicitly does not do in their API. I'm trying to find where this is, but
basically, like,
yeah,
the
so
third
here's an
parameter
example.
could be something. It can be multiple different things.
The first parameter can be different. Like, you can do server.listen options callback or server.listen path backlog callback,
right?
Which is just, it's wonky and hard to, and or server listen port host backlog, like very hard to define that. And so we would have to kind of, if we wanted to use docs parser, which like is possible, we would need to kind of extend it in a way that allows us to have these alternate
like variants.
Yeah, variants.
It's basically like same method,
yeah,
but here's the three variants. Basically, you could document the three methods separately.
Yeah,
but then they need to be somehow tied back together, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I guess does, and TypeScript as an example, would it allow you to just treat them as separate methods?
No, well, yes. Let's just, TypeScript supports method overrides. So effectively, this can definitely be represented in the type system quite easily. You just have to know that they're the same method on the same object, and TypeScript, you can just provide two different methods to it, as long as only one has an implementation, which isn't a problem on your side because you're not only defining types. That would be totally fine. It would just be a matter of you knowing how to describe it. Sorry, there's loads of dogs in my room now. That's why I'm constantly muted.
Right. I was just thinking, like, just ignore that there's multiple variations. The first thing would be just like, if these all had different names, it should just be okay, right? And so now we have three things with the same name. And the first question is like, if we just generated that, what would the consuming tools do? And I guess because they have the same name, couldn't they just figure out they're actually the same thing? And like, I'm wondering, do we need more metadata to say they're the same thing? Well, they've got the same name, so maybe that's enough right there.
I'd say so.
So I don't know, Tierney, like back to the Electron one, like if they just actually considered them as completely different things and generated the output.
I mean, I think it's more how do you represent? I think in that situation, like you want to make it so the output can be consumed in a similar way to the way the type definitions would be consumed. So you have to figure out how the type definitions are consumed, which I don't know enough TypeScript to be able to say how to do that. And I have a feeling Orda does. But yeah, basically you'd want to figure out how to represent that kind of information in a typing system and then re-represent that in Markdown and then basically allow for the conversion.
But from what Orda said, it sounds like if we just generated these individually, it wouldn't necessarily cause a problem.
What do you mean individually?
Well, like just ignore that there's three things with the same name. Like, they each could be like, listen 1, listen 2, listen 3. And if that was the case, we probably wouldn't be talking. It wouldn't be an issue, right?
But what you're, I guess, like you have to figure out how to write that in documentation because you're not really generating it. You're writing it in docs, and then you're converting the docs to the programmatic representation. So how do you write that in docs?
We've already written it in docs. Like I'm just like, we do have three things.
We're not parsing it. Right, we're not parsing it out into like basically what the docs are is an API. You're writing an API.
Yeah.
And so how do you make it so you can like sure you're writing that, but how do you convert that into something that shows up 3 times in the API and is distinguishable and not confusing? Like you can't have the same ID with three times, right?
But why not?
Because it's it's like trying to
in JSON, I guess, is it a JSON limitation that we couldn't have 3
it's a
things?
JSON limitation, right? And so like you have to figure out how to, in documentation, you have to figure out how to indicate, and this could be a similar function of like, the kind of front matter-esque style that we're doing now with YAML. However we implement that, we could do a similar thing, but like you do have to figure out how to implement that. And I'm not saying like I know how to implement it because I don't, but you have to figure that out. It's not, you can't just do it and have it work. Like you actually have to think about how to implement something so it can be rendered 3 times or included 3 times. And then which like there's ways you can do that. Like I'm coming up with ways in my head, but I haven't done that.
But like our JSON must have those 3 things.
It does have those 3 things, but it's doing it in it's not doing it in a way that is relying on like outputting types, right?
No, I know, but I'm still just trying to like, so I think we currently take this markdown, convert it to, do we consume that JSON? I think from what you said before, we consume that JSON to generate our HTML or something, do we?
I think so, yeah. I think we build our website with the JSON. I could be wrong on that though.
Right.
It's JSON server.listen.
Yeah,
it's just an array of objects. So we're not doing it in a particularly API-ish way. We're just throwing an array of objects.
Right. So it's basically, but I think that goes back to like from the question to Orda is that actually a problem to consume in TypeScript?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, it represents, as long as you have, you can follow some of the similar patterns that you have in Objective-C when overrides exist, and that you treat the parameters as part of the function name so that you can have a way to differentiate between them. But, the way that, even if you were just dumbly taking this markdown and turning it into an interface each time, that would actually end up just working outright in TypeScript today, because it allows for the same overriding and augmenting when you actually have two things with the same name on the same object, class, function, whatever. So I don't think it's necessarily something you need to worry about from the side of how can TypeScript and the DT scripts handle it. It's more like just making sure that it works fine for everyone.
Yeah, and like that I'm glad to hear that, and I think the problem presently is just changing Electron and docs parser, changing docs parser to accept multiple things with different signatures, like different function signatures.
Right. Does that I mean, is that a smaller change than you were thinking it might have been?
Probably not. It's the same amount of work either way. Yeah, it's the same amount of work, no matter what.
Okay, I mean, I was just like, that's
one element of what would need to be changed with docs parser. Now, like I am fully happy to go with run with docs parser and like have. I don't think I can do it alone, but if folks want to work on that, I'm more than happy to do that. And I've asked Electron before; they're happy to take those contributions and work with us on that. So they're not opposed to it at all.
I'm just trying to like for us to understand like how small is the delta, because if the delta is quite small, it would be easier than like if it's. I'm always eternally optimistic, right? So I'm like, today it's for some reason says you can't, it sees those as the same and there's some conflict or something like, so can a little bit of code that says, no, it's okay, just add a qualifier or something to them but so that's one. Are there other examples of like where that you've seen it have a really hard time?
There are some bugs with multiple class exports. I think there is a PR up that has not been merged that fixes that. So that's not particularly a challenge. I'm not outside of that. I can't recall. I believe I stopped working on this because of that, and it fundamentally breaking the export. So it's kind of hard to validate things. But yeah, that was the specific big one. And I know there's some other. I've been told. I haven't seen, but I've been told that there's some other specific, more esoteric APIs in Node Core that are challenging for docs parser.
Right. So I guess it comes back to benefit. If we could only, but this is back to like the people on the type side. If we tried to move to something like this, but it only covered 80% of the APIs, is that still a win, right? Like if there's a few, 2 or 3 that are like, we're just never going to be able to get it, is it still useful doing it on the rest of them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it totally is. I mean, to assume that all of the work would be on your side here is a wee folly, and the DT side would definitely be able to fix any of that 20% side, or even just ignore it, right? Remember, today we have no automation tooling around it, and we're doing okay. So the automation tooling augments that existing experience, basically.
Okay. So yeah, so that okay. So it sounds like from this discussion, the biggest win would be adding a little bit more structure. And I think, from the example Tierney showed me, some of it is relatively straightforward, which is adding, like, I guess if we added that to our markdown. So I'm also trying to think like, what does it break on our side, right? So today we have a flow. We start with what we've got in the docs. That generates as our HTML. If we started to add that extra structure, which is the, like, okay, here is methods. We've added a new header and we've pushed headers down. Would that break any of the existing flow? Or would we just get an HTML and Markdown that has a few more headings?
I honestly have no clue. I don't know how that side of things works. That's not been something I've touched.
Okay. My guess has got to be no, because we don't tell people not to write with a certain number of headers or whatever. So
yeah, I mean, so the approach I'd say here is basically adopt the Electron style guide as how we should write things. And like, there's definitely going to be problems. There's definitely not problems, but like differences. and address those differences and like maybe update them. But yeah, overall, use the Electron style guide and start switching some docs over. That allows us to get the better structure. I think like it seems to be a better structure to me, at least, than what we presently have, which is just as mentioned earlier, a lot of methods without like a lot of structure. So it gets us a little bit closer on that, and then we can begin again, I want to make sure that I'm saying this, like I cannot do these docs parser changes myself. Like alone, that's not something I can do. So I'm trying to be transparent with that. But if folks want to work on that and want to work on getting some of those changes updated, I think it's very doable.
And I guess the docs parser is we don't actually need to use that for anything unless we want to try and like enforce the style guide and stuff, right?
No, because that's what docs parser is what outputs the JSON. So if we want to give that JSON representation, you use docs parser.
I guess though we already have something that generates JSON, and if
so our JSON
if we move to the what was that?
Our JSON is like comparatively useless to what docs parser outputs. Docs parser outputs an API that's readable.
Right, okay.
Ours puts out raw text.
Right. Okay.
It puts
so
out
it
the
doesn't
text
get us something that's more useful. Yeah. Okay. I've got that now.
Yeah.
I guess if we start to change what we do publish, that would also make it harder. Like it would break the existing tool on the definitely type side, right?
Yeah.
I think we'd be fine with that. Like, I mean, I can't speak for Simon. It's all his work, but if we don't run it for a while because things are broken, that's totally okay.
The other thing too is like that JSON we might need to generate the HTML, right? So it may be that that's just there because, and so we might need to figure out how like you would have a different set of JSON that you could use, because that maybe we can't get rid of that anyway. But okay, but yeah, I kind of understand that. Okay, it's this separate parser. So you've run it, Tierney, a few times. And what percentage of the API today would it generate for? Probably some small
zero.
subset.
Zero.
Okay.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work for our API. Like I rewrote query string. It works for query string. I think it works for another one, but when I redid V8 is like kind of a more challenging one, and V8 is where it breaks because it has multiple class exports. So anything that doesn't have multiple classes can be converted relatively easily. Once you get to multiple classes, it breaks. I can also push to try to get that PR.
But I think that sounds like something that may get fixed, right? So
yeah, and I think we should also be looking at this as we are taking on a dependency that we will want to help maintain. We don't want to just rely on them maintaining it. We want to help maintain this because there are things that we need that they don't, and they have no reason to do. Sure. So yeah.
So I guess some possible next steps, because we are nearing the end of the time for this particular section, is one, I guess we need to discuss whether we could use the Electron style guide. I mean, the question is there a negative to doing that even if we had no additional automation?
I don't think so. I think it actually helps make our docs a lot more readable.
Right. So yeah, that's sort of my take, was it would structure things more nicely. And even if we just did that, there's still some value in terms of like, yeah, okay, we've got a better structure.
And then, for what it's worth, I am happy to do work on like going through every doc and remaking it fit that.
Right. So I think before we did that, it'd be good to get the discussion like TSC agreement that like, yeah, this makes sense. This should be like an initiative where we want to move from where we are to there, right? And it supports, we can say it supports a number of things. You know, one might be doing better on our type side, better just visible stuff in terms of the docs and so forth. So we could discuss if we could use the Electron style guide. We could explore, I I guess it's like the Explorer. So what did you call it again? It was the parser. It's
docs parser.
Docs parser. I'm just like, whenever I hear let's rewrite a whole new thing, like that is even a bigger effort than like, can we tweak something, right? And I'm like, okay, well then we really need somebody who's going to do something versus maybe we could tweak a few and get,
that's fair.
80% or something. So explore docs parser. And so there's sort of, it sounded to me like there's one fundamental fix that if it got made, you'd be a lot more positive in terms of how much we could potentially generate, right?
Yeah, I think that would help a lot. There also might be other things that I haven't hit yet, so keep that in mind too. But yeah,
sure. It's like, okay, so does multiple export fix get allowed generation for more enough? I'm going to say enough stuff. So it's basically like if the multiple exports fix allowed generation of say 80% of what we had, I'd be like, hey, that's enough that maybe we should have an initiative to move things over because we think that's good for a number of reasons, and even like a job that would generate it somewhere because that would be adding value, it sounds like, to the type side of things. And I guess it's in terms of running that doc parser, even like do the consumers need us to generate and publish JSON, or is it just that we want our docs to be publishable?
I mean, it's free to run it. Like it takes like 10 seconds. It's not a lot. I would recommend running it and publishing it regardless. And again, there are like, if we actually do run it and publish it, there are some additional benefits that we can get around, like there is potential for actually improving the development lifecycle for Node, which I think is a benefit as well.
But that's not I'm just looking like MVP might be just something where we run the docs parser and validate, like say if we've converted over a file, we tag that as like that file's been converted, and we run the validation during PRs and stuff to make sure that we don't regress that.
Yeah. Yep.
And then, even if we never publish that, then the consumers could actually run it themselves, generate the JSON. Because once you publish, just publishing something and saying we're now maintaining this publicly is another step, right? And, okay. So I'll just say as a possible MVP.
I mean, the one thing I would say is that it would change how our current API, our current JSON is output, which I don't know if we care. But it would, the markdown changes fundamentally in structure. So I don't know if that matters.
Questions, right. Would change how existing markdown looks. Did we, so one of the questions is, do we have any commitments? Sorry, go.
Yeah, we would probably need to change the HTML generator as well.
Well, I think, but it mostly isn't the structure just adding new headings?
It's shifting things around, adding headings. There is markdown changes, like how things are written does change in some spots. I think that'd be less of a thing for the HTML stuff though.
Yeah, like that's my question. I'm guessing like adding new headings and indentation and whatever, that shouldn't break something that generates markdown from HTML. It might look different in the output, but we're thinking that's actually, it would look better.
Well, there was the question about the HTML comments. If we change them, that will have to be adapted.
Yeah.
Those comments, are those used on the type side, like the introduced in and all that kind of stuff?
I can't be sure. Give me a second. I'll just take a quick look.
Sure.
Yeah, and like that is, I think that's a very good point around the metadata for like how we structure the markdown. that is an augment that we would want to make to the Electron style guide. Basically, that is something we would want to add to it. Is it rather than having additional like front matter, having it be a part of the markdown.
Right.
What
The
is
only.
perfect?
Sorry. Go ahead.
It is added in.
It is used. Okay. So that would be. Because
To
that
be
would
honest,
yep. Go ahead.
I would like it to be part of the markdown so that we could actually see it in GitHub when it's rendered.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, same. Yeah, it bothers me that we do YAML front matter and HTML comments, but I've tried to hold that opinion.
I love it. It's a great hack.
It is a hack. It works, but yeah, I think having it as a part of like it increases readability. It helps in a lot of different ways, I think, for end users.
Okay, so that's something I'm just added. Like for the MVP, we would need to move the metadata into Markdown so that it's visible. That would require a change to the HTML. Would require a change to the HTML generator, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that would probably need to be able to do either or, because we're not going to we're not going to change everything at the same time.
I mean, one approach we could take to this is leave existing docs as they are and have a new docs section somewhere and kind of split the two and like let docs exist as they are without having, I guess that gets difficult with docs changes and having to like port those over. It gets annoying.
I just don't see having two copies of the same thing being practical. Like,
yeah, that's fair.
That's just a recipe for. So I think we gotta come up with an incremental. I change one file. Okay, it's now in a new format. I change the next one, and
the more formatting changes we make to the structure, the harder it's going to be to backport changes into the older release lines like LTS. It's already challenging if, like, for example, someone reorders things in the existing format. So if sections are moved around, that already causes merge conflicts when you try and backport stuff. So the metadata one in particular, I think, could be disruptive if we no longer have those, or they're in a different format to the and maybe that is something we'll just swallow if the benefits outweigh the inconvenience. But it's all sort of considerations with how we move.
Right.
For example, the reason that we have the two, the introduced in and the added, the added YAML metadata, that's turned into a twisty in the HTML docs. So in the HTML docs and Node, when you look at a particular method, if it's got like added a sort of changed YAML, there'll be a little twisty there where you can drop the twisty down and it will tell you which, when someone's actually written into the metadata, this particular version changed this method in this way. For example, it might have changed the parameter or clarified something. The introduced in is for there's a drop down on the website for previous versions of the doc. So, for example, if you were to open, trying to think of one off the top of my head, but one of the modules, if you were to open it and it only existed from like node 6, the introduced in would tell the docs, the node HTML generator that this doc only exists from like node 6 onwards, so it wouldn't generate an alternate link for, say, a node 4 version of the doc. Those are all things we can change, but that's kind of the reason we've got both bits of information. Yeah.
Right. So that would take some, like the metadata possibly being duplicated temporarily might be able to mitigate some of those issues. I don't know, but I think, so certainly the backporting is going to be, you're right, because if we change the docs, that's going to definitely have an issue.
Yeah, If it's like levels of indentation, I don't see it being too much of a problem.
Right.
But definitely, if we were to say strip out all of the the existing metadata, then yes,
Sure.
that could be a challenge.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And
Okay,
just
we
one more
are.
thing to
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add one more thing to, I know that the website redesign group is looking at docs and how to integrate them well into Gatsby using front matter metadata as well. So I know that that's kind of a topic for them too, just FYI.
Do you know if that relates at all to generating a JSON format, or?
I think so.
I think they're consuming it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our existing one, or?
I think that they want to make changes to the existing stuff to enhance the integration into Gatsby.
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it would be good to understand what those changes might be. And
Ben Halverson, I think, is the one that's been focused on that effort at the redesign group.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. I guess I
so
might.
Go ahead.
I guess one thing is it's never been clear to me who exactly is consuming the JSON files that we are currently producing.
Mm-hmm.
We know that people are, but I don't think we have a full grasp of all of the consumers of that format. So the more we can identify, because obviously if we're going to, if there's any chance in future that we are going to change the structure of the JSON, we need to sort of at least notify people, or get as much feedback as possible that it covers the use cases that people are using existing stuff for.
Yeah, I don't know how we'd get that list.
Yeah, that's a rough one.
I want to be cognizant of the time.
Yep.
Because we're getting over.
Yeah, I think we're about at time. So sorry, did you want to add something specific on that? Okay, so yeah, I think we've used the time for this section. I do want to ask, and I guess there's like some, yeah, I'll ask it anyway, because I think we may not have time to talk, but like other approaches are like to generate the documentation from comments in the code itself. I assume that's just not something that we should consider, or or is that another alternative that obviously much bigger, but I just am curious, or like everybody like, no, that's just not a non-starter, or it doesn't make any sense, or lots of other projects, we've seen other projects do that.
So sorry, go ahead, Richard.
I was just to say that could be challenging for some bits of the docs, because not all of the docs are straight API docs. So for example, there's all that stuff about module loading, which I don't know how you would represent that as in doc comments. So you would need either some hybrid approach or a complete rethink as to the current documentation structure.
Okay, so I just, like, I'm assuming that's just too big a change to even consider here. What we're talking about is much more incremental.
Paris has their hand raised.
Personally, as a person that likes to support the documentation, I know for the developer, it's easier when it's together, but for a person that just wants to work on the documentation, sometimes it's easier when it's separated. So I would say that if it's already separated, I would prefer just to keep it separated, because once you start switching back and forth, now you have the legacy people getting confused where it is, and then you have a certain amount of documentation that's not consistent. So, and I don't know if we want to do a major work on that.
Okay, yeah, I think that's in line with, it's just like, in my mind, probably too big a change to even consider.
The only other thing I'd say on that is that also reminded me of one of the things that I've been told about docs parser is that the native APIs can't really be docs parsed as easily. So that's a challenge, but yeah. And you couldn't do that with docs in code anyway. So
those don't need to be in the things that types consume anyway, though, right?
Oh, yep. Theoretically, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think now would be a good time. We could take like a 15-minute break, if that works for everybody, and then we'll come back. So why don't we come back at noon? and we'll kick off the second session if that works for everybody. Okay, I will leave the stream going, but stop my video and I'll be back in 12 minutes, I think it is now. Thanks.
Are we back, Michael?
Sorry, back now.
Cool.
Okay. So yeah, we're a few minutes late. Sorry about that. So now we can jump into our second topic, which is the single executable applications. This was another one of the things that came out of our discussion on Next 10 that's important to the success of Node going forward. As a use case that enough people use, that we should make sure that we think we're doing the right thing to support. In terms of that, I don't know what the best way to get started is. I'm not super familiar. I know we have a number of people from Vercel who've been working on a package, so maybe it makes sense for you to just give us an intro overview of that and where you've seen it used and that kind of stuff, and we can go from there. Does that make sense?
I also don't know if he's here still. I
If they're
think he said
back?
he had to dip. Yeah, he had to
Okay.
dip, and he said he'd be back later, but he is not. Yeah, I have another meeting. He'll be back 30 minutes ago. So
okay,
I can poke him if you'd like. Okay. Yeah.
Sure. Does anybody here have any context thoughts on that while Tierney does that?
I mean, the one I'd like to kind of have us look at is Box Node, which is from MongoDB that Anna Hensington is either the primary maintainer of, or the only maintainer of, or somewhere in between. That seems to be very good.
So I guess the one that's maybe the first part is kind of identifying what current solutions are there. I mean, I think you mentioned Box Node, and then there's I think it's just called PKG.
Yeah, PKG.
And I think when I looked, there was one other one that popped up.
Yeah, there's I think one or two more.
Where was it? Let's see if I can find my notes. So NXC seemed to be the other one that I came across in terms of, yeah, PKG, NXC, and then Box Node were the three that I kind of came across.
NXC.
I don't know if like, do we have anybody here who's oh, there we have.
Yes, Staples back.
Yeah. Okay. So we were just starting the discussion on the single executable applications. We were wondering, Stifle, if maybe you could give us, since you're maybe the most up to speed here, give us some context. What kind of places do people use this for today that you're aware of, and sort of kick off the discussion?
Yeah, so we kind of have a history of trying different solutions, and that's how we have kind of three different tools that are three slightly different ways of bundling. So I think the first one, maybe Igor knows a little more of the history here, was PKG, and it kind of bundles the Node.js executable with the user's code into a single binary. And I think that's similar to what Dino uses. And then we have another option, which is NCC. And then what this does is compiles all the JavaScript into a single file. And so then you're not distributing a node binary, you're just distributing a single JS file. So like we'll use this for CLIs, for example. So you can npm install, and you just have a single JS file, and then it has, you know, the executable directive at the top, but it still relies on Node.js. You still have to install Node.js separately. And then the third solution we came up with was NFT, and that's even a step further back, which is tracing every, like given a single input file, find all the dependent files that it relies on. So, you know, import, require, and recursively figure out every possible file as well as every possible asset that might be from a read file. And then you just get a trace back. You can do whatever you want with that. You can remove those files that are no longer used and come up with kind of the smallest amount of files you need, but there's no bundling done there. So there's kind of three possibilities when it comes to, you know, I think they're all similar, but they're kind of different purposes. But yeah, does that help explain?
I think a little bit, like what would also be like, you know, where have you seen people using any one of those three in the Node ecosystem? Like, you know, in terms of creating a Node exe, are there some examples where people are doing that to ship certain things that they, you know, as opposed to shipping it as a separate, you know, separately versus bundled?
Yeah, so I think the benefit of like PKG, where you get a single executable, is like people who are unfamiliar with the Node.js ecosystem don't need to know anything about it, and they don't need to install Node separately, and they don't need to worry about which version of Node.js is necessary. So it's, you know, if like a CLI, I guess, is a good example of like, you know, you want to have a single binary, or maybe not even a CLI, maybe you have some sort of like GUI that you've, you know, written with Electron or something, but having a single binary is kind of desirable there because it's easy to download, it's easy to run, and I think, yeah, conceptually, like as an end user, it makes more sense. It just introduces some more complexity. I don't know if the person who's currently maintaining PKG is here, but I saw like there was a comment about some of the file structure there. And I think, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is what Dino has for their solution for a single executable.
Right, okay. And does the size of that binary matter so much, or just curious on that front?
Yeah, so I mean, it just depends where. So one of the reasons why we don't really use PKG that often anymore is because like Vercel is more focused on serverless serverless architecture, where you know, maybe Node.js is already supplied by the platform, and then we want the user's code to be bundled and make it as small as possible. So like we don't. So in that case, it's not really desirable to like ship Node.js together. Then you have two copies of Node.js, or it's not as efficient. You want to like only ship the parts that have changed, and that would be the user's code.
Okay, anybody else have questions, things you want to poke at before we can start to dive into like those three different, though, you know, I guess only really the first one, the PKG one, is sorry, of the three you outlined, like NCC, NFT, and PKG, only really the first one gets you a single binary, right?
Right.
Yeah. And is that also the only one? Like, you know, it sounded to me like the NCC and FT, those don't necessarily need changes or additions in Node itself, right?
So the first one, PKG, I think does require changes. Like there are some patches there. The other ones, yeah, I mean, today they work totally in userland. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if there's like specific changes that to Node.js core that would benefit. but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I mean, I
Okay.
think to the point that you're bringing up, Miles, or I started to mix Miles, Michael, and Michael with a K. Like, I don't know why all three names came to my head at once. Sorry, Michael. To the point of the difference between the three, I think all three could be something that would be an interesting strategy. Like, if we try to do, effectively node in a box, allowing for a little bit more extensibility and room in the future for kind of different approaches to the same problem, or well, similar problems, I guess, could be interesting. But yeah, I think for what we're talking about here, PKG is probably the closest. Although I think NFT is, God, I struggle to say that. I think NFT is potentially interesting as a tool.
Okay. So I guess then, yeah. So if we look at PKG and I guess also box node, the question comes down to, is the current situation good, effective, ideal, or is there something that, it'd be useful for the project to do to support, people who want to do this, and not necessarily provide it built in, but to provide things that help anybody who wants to do this do it more effectively.
Stifle also put in a set of additional implementations of basically the same thing.
Okay.
Which seems like there's quite a few, which indicates to me that this is a problem that is probably a good one for us to solve. If we're having this many different implementations of it.
Right, so I'm just adding that link into here. So I guess, yeah, no, that's true with a bunch of different ones. So I guess maybe it would be good to look at what, what are the common challenges then in terms of, when for PKG or the other options, like, do we know what is it that's hard to do today that we should call out that list? I don't know, Stifle, if you want to jump in on that one, or.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if Igor is still around, but I think Igor probably has some more intimate knowledge of how PKG is implemented and some of the challenges. Are you around, Igor?
Yeah. Well, I would divide the whole thing into 3 parts. It's compile time. Oh, actually 2 parts: compile time and runtime. Well, compile time is what PKG is doing by traversing the require calls. And I have to say that NFT advanced, and it also collects different kinds of assets. Well, it would be actually great to join the efforts for both NFT and PKG. So the compile time is how we collect them, right? How we define the list of the files that are barely needed, right? That are the minimum that is needed. And the runtime is actually how we store all of them, in what form. For example, NCC makes a single JavaScript file as a bundle of all those files collected at compile time. Another approach for runtime is what PKG does. It has its own binary format that indexes them, so it's easy to find the location of every file in that big binary blob. And PKG attaches that blob to the node executable. So this is the only executable that is shipped. Well, it's difficult for me to say how Dino works. Well, I need to dive deep a bit more. So yeah.
I guess on that, yeah, that's a good breakdown. Makes me think. I think one of the challenges, which this was mentioned in the one of the posts for the person who couldn't make it, but did provide some useful info, was they currently, you know, I think in PKG and for Box Node, it requires compiling Node itself. That seems like a bit of a challenge, right? Like,
you know, here is a point. These projects aim to assist those developers who want to ship a commercial version and to sort of hide their intellectual property. So V8 allows this by compiling into bytecode that we assume is not reversible. And this is why we need a recompilation of Node.js. So we allow Node.js to consume the V8 bytecode. And yeah, it requires patches. While if we don't have this aim and we only want to only single executable to be there, and we are okay that all the sources, all the files are recoverable from that executable, then we don't need. It needs checking. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm almost sure that current Node.js process, current Node.js executable is totally fine with it. We can like join them together. I mean, Node.js file and the payload, and starting it can look around. So some minor changes are needed only. But still, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is still a place where Node.js decides what is the mode it is running. If I remember correctly, the same place it is deciding if it's going for REPL or for a script, you know. And that was another mode added along with REPL and script. There was a like self-executable mode was added. So yeah.
Right, there's the link to the comment in the issue, which I think has a little bit of details. Because it strikes me that like that is a challenge. Just in like I worked in prep, I worked through and I created some exes using the box node and using PKG, and both of them required a reasonable amount of time to actually create the executable, which seemed like a bit of a challenge to me. And I can also understand, like, I think PKG downloaded some binaries that you'd created, but that requires, you know, keeping those up to date, and they only had support for certain platforms and that kind of stuff. So I would wonder if there's a way we could get to the point where you wouldn't, you know, what would it take in a perfect world where we could use the existing node binaries in that workflow? Does that even make sense, right?
Yeah, the problem is that when run, node binary is run without arguments, right? It's shipped and it has its arguments in CLI, and those arguments are not for node anymore. They are for that CLI tool entirely. So the node binary should figure it out that is being run in that packaged mode, and all the CLI arguments should be passed to the internal application that is bundled.
Right. Now, I guess is the I'm just thinking of different things like, is it that, you know, if there was an executable that then you could you take the existing node executable, assuming it in, you know, when it ran, it was going to do the right thing, and then create a new executable which incorporates that, you know, but obviously you would need to create a new exe with extra additional data, right? Like the code segments or whatever for node plus some other stuff. Is that technically feasible? I guess.
Yeah, we have a good example is as far as I remember, self-extracting archives, like, you know, WinRAR. It's possible to run an executable. It does some extracting behind the scenes to some temporary directory, and then it runs some executables that were just extracted. So is that what you mean?
What I guess I was thinking more of like an actual single binary that could just run, but and from that binary do what you needed to do. So it'd still actually be a single binary, but that it's somehow, you know, we've got what we've published on the Node.js download site, right? Like, is there some flow where you take that and then you take the binary and you run it through some process that ends up with a new binary that can, you know, run an application? I mean, the self-extracting archive, I guess, is an example where.
Could I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask if you can promote Guy.
Yep, sure.
Thanks.
Like if you extract it, it's not quite the same because you're converting, and maybe that's perfectly fine, but that's a case where you could just extract and then run node normally, couldn't you?
Yeah, like some executable extracts node, extracts JavaScript files and runs the node with those JavaScript files as an entry point. But this is just because well, you're saying let's try to preserve the node.js binary, because ideally, if we are not having this constraint and if we can do whatever we want, the most quick startup, for example, is how PKG does. It quickly detects its run in packaged mode, and it goes to the index of its entry point file, and it reads only one file. It is a JavaScript file, and it entirely works as a normal application. It picks files separately. It's not, for example, chewing the whole JavaScript bundle. It's not wasting time on all the whole JavaScript bundle. So having such a internal file system that allows access to individual files is a good speed benefit, I guess. I guess the same is how Electron stores files in SR archive, but correct me if I'm wrong, please.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I was more just trying to understand, is it like, if there, like, obviously what we publish will never include the application, right? So it could include some additional functionality, but then can you take that new node version and then externally package it together with your application and then generate a binary? That may be exactly what PKG does. But
go ahead. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that it's another level of programming. It's some system level, some the way every platform has executables with its own format.
Yep.
I was trying to stick with the same, well, same surface, same way node.js runs without that system foo. Moreover, it's unfortunately the current maintainer of PKG is not around, so I may be lagging behind. But well, it used to be an unsolved problem for PKG to make such executables that are signable by macOS sign tool, by Windows sign tool. It's an important point for commercial customers that want to ship the executables confidentially. I mean, well, sort of, so that their own users in turn are confident. I mean that they are they have the verified issuer. So it requires some extra effort to craft such a binary format to make it work. But I have to say that I was inspired by WinRAR, self-extracting archive, self-executable archive, and I know that that problem is solved there. So I know it's feasible.
Right. Okay. And I think the comment, I'm just reading the comment from Jessica again, who maybe didn't identify whether they're current maintainer or not, but it basically, they showed us some patches. The Bootstrap script that executes a script locating a certain offset in the executable can bake in node options, lets the V8 bytecode execute without source, which I guess that's the part which is like, hey, if you want to hide things, that's needed. And then the miscellaneous disable inspector, enable LTO. I'm not quite sure why those are needed, but. And then the project itself, right? Okay, the dependency tracer generates list of files required by the user project, produces bytecode JavaScript files, generates a snapshot that contains the metadata files, offset ranges, prelude script that's baked into the executable and executor on launch, and the virtual file system that reads the files in snapshot with the offset of the executable, right? By overriding Node.js functions.
One question I have is the V8 executable bytecode without source, is that something we could just turn on? Like, I'm not familiar enough with that to know. Is that something we could basically make it so you don't have to patch, or so this wouldn't have to be patched in a solution for this?
I think those are in V8. I'm looking. L12 to 129. So those changes in that patch actually seems to be in V8 itself. I'm not sure we'd really want to be floating a custom V8.
Yeah.
So that might be more of a question for the V8 team. Would it make any sense to have an option there that we could turn on?
Yeah.
It's not a huge amount of change, but
it's really not. I'm surprised by how little.
Yeah, that might be worth asking that team if there's like a like any does it make any sense that that would be an option that could be turned on? Now it may be related to, I see some option like Fuse linker plugin or something, like maybe it changes optimization or something.
I was going to ask, is it not related to the user snapshots? That I know there is work going on to enable in Node.
I think is user snapshots is not a must for this kind of packaging solution to work. It's more like something that can be used by these solutions if they don't want to initialize the application every time the user starts launch the application. as far as I understand, like right now you package your initialization scripts, and you will use them, you execute them to get to the state before your application starts to run. So userland snapshot would be some kind of nice to have feature that can be used on top of that, but it's not a necessity for them.
It would help you start up faster.
Yeah. Yeah. So userland snapshot, you don't, for example, you don't have to bundle the initialization scripts. You only need to bundle the heap. That's the result of execution of those scripts.
Are they an option for like a way to bundle a full application in?
You mean options in the packaging solutions?
Yeah, like I guess like one of the challenges is like, how do you get the application bundled in with Node itself? And I'm just wondering if like a snapshot is a potential way of doing that.
So after the application is snapshotted, you probably still want to do some work to actually make it work. So that might involve, for example, taking a user input to do something, for example. So that's what this kind of packaging solution would need to take care of. In terms of userland snapshot, only takes care of the part of the initialization. So for example, if you want to have a bundled app that when run, for example, it starts a HTTP server. So with userland snapshot, you might be able to like run an HTTP server beforehand and snapshot it, but it has to be closed before you can snapshot it, because we cannot resurrect system handles, for example. So you would still need to have some scripts that, like with a deserialized heap, with a deserialized HTTP server, you open it up again, and maybe you need to do some cleanups or further initialization to actually make it like set it up to a point where you can make it functional. So that kind of post initialization script would be something that this kind of packaging solution would also need to take care of. So yeah, those are, so it would be like userland snapshots would be something that they can work with, but it's not a prerequisite or something they need to depend on.
So you couldn't say you convert your whole application to a single JavaScript file, and then you created a user snapshot with that, like basically that ran some code from that file, that wouldn't have loaded that file into the that whole file into the snapshot necessarily.
Which file were you talking about?
Well, there's like a single, so you've used one of the other tools that was mentioned to convert your application into one single big JavaScript file. So you've got one JS file. We now want to package that with an executable somehow. And I'm wondering, like, the snapshots must package some of the user code into the snapshot, right? And I'm wondering if it was all just in one file, would you have effectively packaged that all of the source into the snapshot?
It would, but it's mostly as because what is snapshots is the heap as a result of execution of some scripts. So if you execute some scripts to get to the heap will also retain the source as a way for debugging. So for example, if you, after deserializing the heap, you hit some function that you want to debug in the debugger, we will need the source to display in through the inspector protocol. So it will retain that source
in the snapshot.
Yes.
So if I wrote sorry, go ahead.
It would be, but I suppose with something that the PKG patches do, they probably, like, if that kind of patches are also applied on top of something that implements userland snapshot, my guess is the script will also go away. So you won't be able to debug that, but it will still work because bytecode is in there. So that's not really something that has to be in the snapshot. It can also be removed. It's just not implemented because we usually need them for debugging.
Right. I'm just looking at, like, instead of having, you know, if we already have snapshots, if somebody created if you boiled your application down to a single JavaScript file, you created a snapshot, and then when Node started, it found the snapshot somehow and loaded it and ran. You know, is that a packaging mechanism that makes sense, or is that just missing? Like, would that actually end up with something that you could run having everything, everything you needed is in that snapshot versus needing additional stuff? Does that make any sense?
I guess it's probably not enough. If you want to build a single executable with only the snapshot, because you usually need to do something post snapshot deserialization to take user input, for example, because usually an application needs to take user input to perform the action it needs. So
you mean like the command lines, or?
Yeah. So for example, taking a command line argument, or maybe some additional script to clean up. So you usually need some additional input. And also, I think one thing that the snapshot implementation can handle is the virtual file system that these packaging solutions tend to have. So, for example, if you need to load a module on demand after, so because you don't always, if you have third-party code, sometimes they need to load some additional module on disk on demand. So you need some kind of virtual file system to handle that. Otherwise, these modules will probably not work. And the packaging solution would have a solution for that problem. So unless we implement something like that in Node, that has to be solved by an external thing.
Right. I was just thinking, like, could you package that full virtual file system into that single JavaScript file, which you then...
So without additional tweaking, it can also package anything that's loaded during the time of snapshot building. If you assume something is in the system, but you do not load it, and you postpone the loading to the time after the heap is deserialized, then it won't work because it's not going to actually be in the heap.
Yeah, it's probably, the more I think about it, the more there's probably too many complications there.
Yeah, it's probably better for an external solution to handle the virtual file system problem.
So I guess, Igor, I guess it comes back to, is there a separation that makes sense in terms of, like, it seems like, well, I'm just going back to the comment in that issue that was posted, like what it currently does is, it's like there's some changes to basically say, okay, we're going to have something Node do something a little different on startup. and then the packager manages building the executable in the format that's needed by that. What I'm not sure is Box Node may take a different approach, because I think it compiles the whole, like it recompiles Node itself as part of the process, versus I think package PKG, you need to recompile it so you end up with an exe that has different capabilities, but then you don't recompile the whole thing every time you package up an application.
Yeah, it's true.
So I'm just looking at, I'm again going back to that patch, just trying to understand, like, what is the,
I mean, one
go
of the things that Box Node specifically calls out is that it creates binaries that can be signed and notarized on Mac OS, which I assume is part of the compiling it every time. I would imagine.
Yeah, I agree. I think the same way.
I mean, it seems like, you know, there's there's paths, engineering paths that we can take to accomplish certain things, like compile it once or provide a precompiled one and then have them recompile it when they want to actually like build a final build compared to like a dev build. But I don't know if we're going to be able to get around the compiling stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's, for this use case, is that an obstacle or not, right? Like, if I wanted to write a very simple, like maybe it's the target that's important as well. Like if I wanted to write a really simple command line thing equivalent to like a bash script and get it into a single executable, that would be a challenge. You know, compiling for how long it takes to compile would be a challenge. Now, I guess a bash script equivalent is closer to the other description, which was like, hey, I've got a single file that then starts Node, right?
Right. And I mean, there we could take a dual approach, right? Where we do single file, and then when you actually want to compile it for specific platforms, that's a different thing. That is like the next step that you're basically distributing. You're building your distributable, and then you could use like the normal Node runtime in the meantime while you're working on it.
In terms of the obfuscation, how much, like, do we have a sense of like how much of the people who would wanted to use these solutions, how important that is versus not?
Based on what Igor was saying earlier, it seemed relatively important.
Yeah, an interesting point here could be that other popular programming languages that are hosted, that are compiled, they are giving it out of the box, right? I mean, maybe Golang, Rust.
That makes sense.
Yeah, as I don't think that was based on design. That's just a side effect, right?
Yeah, but anyways.
Yeah, yes, but it still exists. Like it's still a feature.
Yeah, I mean, you can make an argument the other way around, that like distributing source code for interpreted languages is a side effect and not a feature. Like the fact that
yes,
you source code for Node.js wasn't necessarily intended, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. But do people choose a language one over the other for that?
Yeah, I think in some cases, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Taking a note here. The signature, does anybody have a little bit more insight into that signature problem? Like, is it that, like when you saw, I don't know exactly how the signatures work, but like, what is it fundamentally that means you can't sign a binary that would have been generated from the node binary? Or
if I remember correctly, well, executable files have their own formats and they're different on different operating systems, like MZ on Windows, ELF on Linux, and Mac OS, and they have some sections there. And in most of the cases, I have an impression that there is just one more section added to the end of the executable, and that it has some cryptographic signature of all the binary before that section that is added. So we have to not just blindly buffer concat the node binary and our payload. Buffer concat of them is not enough. We need to make our payload a proper section of the executable, so that signature tool sees it as a proper section and understands that it's a proper format and properly adds the signature next to our payload. Otherwise, they say like either a format is unrecognizable of the binary of the executable, or they may simply strip the ending like a trim operation just because, oh, I see something unnecessary as not mentioned in the index table. What is it? It's not needed. And yeah, so it may end up the executable to be signed, but without payload, so they are not functional.
okay, so it's not right. It's because the concatenation would work. Like basically, if you did the concatenation, the operating systems would tend to just ignore the fact that that extra data was there. But once you sign it, they no longer do that. Like the signing tools. Sorry, go ahead.
Without the signature, they don't care. True.
Okay. Now, is that, I'm just thinking like on that front, is that actually, I mean, is the right answer to that the packagers need to be smart enough to like do what you said, like add it as its own section, and then it has to be re-signed? You know, obviously it shouldn't be signed by the node key anymore. It needs to be signed by whatever the application is, you know, whoever's shipping that application's key.
Yeah, I believe the signature can be stripped, so it can be removed, that section from the end. Our section with payload can be added, and the new signature is added after our payload. So yeah. But I believe the proper looking, the proper formatting of the executable is the way to go, because imagine like a regular build of node.js. What does it produce? It produces a pretty proper and well, all the format, well, and yeah, conforming all the necessary format of the executable of this operating system, right? We should follow this idea, and the packager, I believe, should produce an executable the same way to be conformant as well.
Right. I'm just taking a few notes. So like the packager would need to strip the signature from node.js, add the new section in manner that complies with OS exe structure, right? Signing tools to add new signature. Does that sound right? I don't know if you're looking at the notes I've got there, but what I also wonder is, like, would it make sense that, you know, part of the stuff that was in there was like, you know, suggestion to search through the exe to see if there's a packaging thing on startup. I somehow wonder if there would be a way that, you know, that the way to do that would be to have something in Node that says, well, if there's a new section, then let's run that, you know, that section. Like that's a way to find if there's extra code that has been bundled with Node.
Yeah, sounds great. I agree.
So, you know, flow that might make sense is startup. Now that would be platform specific, right? I assume in each platform, though, there's a way to say, tell me what my sections are, right?
Yeah.
One named X exists. And I don't know how you, like, what does it run it mean? You know, then you could, because that would effectively be the header that was suggested. It would be like extract info, which I guess are the command line options. I guess the starting script, that part though, I don't quite understand how that works. That would work because that needs to be, like, before the virtual file system can be in place, some code needs to be inserted to insert the virtual file system, doesn't it? I guess it could load from that section, it could load something which is effectively the bootstrap JavaScript, right?
Yeah, there is a layer in over FS module in PKG, so it tries to mock to inject some virtual file system, so it's not, it looks like the real file system. So yeah, there must be some script, or maybe even some official FS mocking or FS intercepting solution. Right. Because PKG, well, was a standalone tool and it could afford being hacky in few places.
I think that ideally, from my point of view, it's something that we should aim to support independently of the single executable, so that we should separate that in two different features, and one of them is have Node be able to run a single file in some binary format that contains all everything. And the next step is to bundle this file inside the Node executable. And so we would basically have both features of PKG and the other one, I forgot the name, the one that just bundles the project, and it's still Node space, the name of the file.
Right. Okay. So you're saying it's useful to be able to run a binary format of JavaScript file just on its own.
Yes.
And
go on. Go ahead.
Isn't that something that you can already do with bundlers like Webpack, or maybe other, bundlers other?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, but that goes to the next thing that I wanted to say. I think it would be ideal if Node was able to generate that. So if Node was its own bundler.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm actually not sure if that's something I was not maybe paying attention enough. Is the goal to use Node to generate the single executable, or to use another tool to do that? That's
I think
the
in my
Node.js
mind
project would maintain, but I don't know.
I was thinking like an initial step would be to support enough in Node that other projects could do that versus bundling it itself. But that's an equally good question to answer.
I think if you want to test the functionality of being able to run something appended to a node binary, to locate this section and from its own binary and then run it, you probably need something already to generate this kind of artifact for the tests. Then might as well implement it in Node, so that it kind of serves as the source of truth.
Right. I guess it comes down to scope, like do we want to pull that scope into the Node project versus enable other projects to do it? I guess it's how complicated will that be? And I guess it's across platforms. It'll have different solutions, right?
I think it makes sense for Node to be able to patch itself to like, for example, append a section to its own binary and then be able to bootstrap again from that binary. But in terms of what goes into that section, for example, if you need a virtual file system, that might be something that needs to be implemented in the user land.
Right. Okay.
I think there is
you might want a variety of what the virtual file system support, or if it wants to do any I don't know, signature matching to make sure things match, considering security and whatnot. And yeah, and that might be something that's better to be done in the userland. But in terms of just having this one section that node can generate and bootstrap from, that seems to be something that can be done in Node already.
Right, and it could be as simple as like, it can patch itself to add in a single JavaScript file, which, you know, in our test could be like hello world, and then be able to run that from the binary version of the JavaScript that's in there. Yeah, I definitely see your, yeah, that's. Interesting, yeah.
Richard is raising his hand.
Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
That's it. I think separately there is a feature request, isn't there, providing a sort of framework to allow virtual file systems. I think it was userland code that was currently monkey patching FS, and then changes we made broke them. And the sort of question then was, instead of reopening the sort of paths that would be a monkey patch, whether there would be a sort of feature request to have a more sort of official way of being able to provide an alternate file system. So that it wouldn't be that Node itself would be providing, like, say, this virtual file system, but it would provide the framework that a virtual file system could be defined in. I mean, that's so that's, you know, it's sort of a sort of related piece of work potentially.
Yeah, that can be something that we might consider as a separate feature request, because this might also be useful for example, testing frameworks. But yeah.
Right, this might be one more reason that's something to support.
Yeah, I think the two features can probably be implemented independently if they are accepted in core, of course.
In terms of the like a binary JS and obfuscation, I think, Joey, were you mentioning that you think you can already generate that with Webpack, or?
So we need isn't like, I understood that the question was how you could generate this one thing that just bundles every code that you have to run your application. And I think bundlers already kind of they already does that, even though it's not strictly speaking a binary. They could, you know, spit out a JavaScript file, even though it could look like a binary because it's not readable, because it's minimized.
Yeah.
But yeah, but that already is something that kind of like a binary.
Well, there are limitations with bundlers like Webpack. You cannot bundle native modules. I don't know how. Yeah, there. If the code needs to read a file from the disk, that file cannot just be put inside of a JavaScript bundle.
Right. Yeah.
Is that
so
something?
my point is, if we just implement the final the generation of the final binary, we still need to define a format for the section that will be generated in the userland. It cannot be just a JS string.
Right. Yeah. Like, I guess though it could be a JS string plus some, just, you know, here's a section of data that you can define yourself, could it? Like, do we need to know anything about the structure of that, or is it just like, here's your pointer to that? In an array, you know, I don't know, we load it into an array buffer and give it to the JavaScript or something.
I think it would be probably nicer if we somehow define the structure of that section if we want to locate an entry point. Because if the section is just one JavaScript, it's just one block of JavaScript, for example, it probably not would not be very extensible if we want to load additional configurations that might be necessary to handle, I don't know, future use cases. I'm just sensing that there might be complexities that need configurations. So we wouldn't want to define a structure of the section just in case we want to extend that format.
So you're like, we don't want to constrain what that section is going to look like, right?
We can probably have like a top level structure that even if it's just like one key value pair of, you know, the key is the entry point, for example, and the value is a JavaScript string that JavaScript like source string that users define. Even if just one key value pair, but it would be better if we keep that as a structure instead of, you know, just one block.
Yeah. But I think, you know, Michael, and I think I'm thinking it needs to start out with at least two, one being the JavaScript to start running, and two, like a data area where people could put things like the virtual, you know, data for the virtual file system and all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yep.
So one is JS file to start executing data section. And I don't know, Igor, like, if you know, if the node basically located that section on startup, read in the JavaScript bytes, started running them and passed in, I guess, read in the data section too and put it into an array buffer, and then started the JavaScript passing it that array, is that everything the bundle, you know, the something like PKG would need to do the rest?
The rest, meaning, for example?
Well, like, you know, basically having to be able to say if you need a virtual file system, you know, being able to add all, you know, having packaged the data into that other section, being able to extract it from the array buffer and use it and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for PKG, it would be the minimum step from node.js is to read that section. Why? Because imagine we don't place any virtual file system, but instead we place a single JavaScript file that was produced by Webpack or by NCC, our Versal tool. So we simply place that NCC produced JavaScript bundle into that section that node.js is guaranteed to read on startup. And yeah, this is the minimum solution for shipping a CLI. Let it be open source, I mean, recoverable without obfuscation. By the way, we can still obfuscate with Cursor or whatever mangles the variable names, right? So the missing piece to bootstrap any any approach, any tooling is that node.js does something on startup and self-runs like this.
Right, okay. And what about arguments? I think that was the other one mentioned in the other patches, is like, does anything special need to be due to get the arguments to the application?
Well, if we pass the execution to that JavaScript that we obtained from the executable section, it has access to process IRGV, right? So it's up to the script to decide what are those options.
Okay.
So it's covered, I guess.
But maybe we need a feature to actually set the arguments for Node. If you want to make a custom binary that passes some arguments that are not the default ones.
Yes.
How could you do that?
So maybe we need a third section, which is arguments for Node.js. And that could be like a command line. Like that could be basically like we find the section, we read in like another section from that. Sorry, whatever. We find the new section in there. There is a part which is like arguments for Node, and we use that as if it was passed to us on the command line as part of the startup.
Actually, Michael is quite right. We imagine it's not the section with JavaScript. It's section with CLI options. So what we do is we place -e and a long JavaScript line. So this is like, right?
Right, okay.
And that that long line after -e is a Webpack bundle or NCC bundle. And in addition to that, CLI options that that are passed to Node executable, like maybe increased heap or whatever.
I'm wondering if it makes sense to have like a flag that allows you to specify additional node flags. So for example, if you want to pass a VA flag, you sort of like -- some flag equals VA flag values, and possibly no flag values because they're kind of treated the same by no. And exactly what this roof flag, I don't know, would be. So for example, when you run Chrome, so if you want to specify VA flags, you do --JS flags equals VA flags values. So we could make this configurable in the section. So for example, if you want --JS flags to be the thing that takes in additional VA flag values, you specify that in the section. I'm wondering if that would be feasible.
I think what Igor was suggesting was maybe like what's in the section. Like there's two sections, one which is like effectively the command line you want to run, what would have been the Node command line. So it includes any arguments you could pass to Node. And because there's already a -e that would let you execute JavaScript, a string of JavaScript, that would actually cover the code to start running, as well as any options you want to pass. Igor, is that right?
Yeah, right.
And then I think, Joey, that would mean that any of those V8 options, like any option you could pass to Node today, you could pass that way.
You mean in the section?
Yeah, in the section. So in the section, it's like, instead of putting like JavaScript, like having the section be the JavaScript you want to run, it's basically the string that you would have passed to Node on the command line.
Right.
And
yeah, yeah, I was proposing a different kind of solution because you typically, I think you don't want these flags to be static. You may want to try out different flags. For example, if you don't usually want to have the inspector on, but in certain cases you want to launch it with the inspector, then you want to like run it differently instead of having the inspector, the dash inspect flag in the section. So you probably want it to be dynamic instead of being part of the configuration in the section.
right. I guess what happens if you put the same option multiple times on the Node command line? Like, does the last one win?
You can probably like concatenate them.
That's what I was wondering, if like, if you basically had a string bundled in there that was effectively the Node command line you want by default, and then whatever arguments were passed to the exe, we concatenated with it, would that get us the right behavior? I think where that might get us into some trouble is that it would, there might be some arguments which would be the application's arguments. So I think maybe you're back to like, we would need an extra argument. If there's this section, then you'd want to pass the command line arguments to the application, not to not to Node, but then you'd want a way to add in ones you could pass to Node, right?
Yeah, I was suggesting to specify, to allow the users to specify a flag,
right?
Which takes values of VA flags. But if they decide that they don't want this kind of to allow users to specify VA flags, then they can just leave that out in the section, so that users won't be able to, for example, configure VA when they run this bundled thing. But if they do want to, for example, allow users to, like for example, start the inspector in case they want the user to reproduce some issues locally somehow, then they can specify in the section that the bundled thing takes, for example, --JS flags that can accept additional VA flags. And then the user will use this specified flag to pass in additional flags if they want to run to start the thing differently. But that's totally optional. They can just disable it by not specifying anything at all.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, now I understand. I just tried to capture that in the notes that we've got here.
Does that mean if we add this capability that we actually need to parse the flags that the user is passing to the application to detect whether the JS flag is there, and remove it then from the argument?
Right. We can probably like specify that this must be placed right after the right after the thing, the executable. So it has to be the first argument, or we can require that everything every additional flags specified in the section must come first before the user can pass in anything else that can be that need to be passed into the into the executable. So instead of actually parsing the flags, we just look for we only look at the first few flags passing to the bundled binary, and if they don't match, we just give up. So if the first argument is not, for example, dash JS flags as specified in the section, we just ignore it and pass it to the executable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't think we need to speak more about this. It's in the notes.
Yeah, I think that that's sort of like a minimal
more discussion later.
Right, for sure. But like, is this sort of like the minimum that we make sense? And like this would be the minimum we could do in Node that would then enable bundlers and not require them to Node to be recompiled, or would allow signatures. I guess the one thing, I don't think this would support native add-ons, right?
I don't think it's going to be simple to support native add-ons. I think we look into like just having just serializing the add-ons at one point when we were discussing about snapshots, because it would also be nice if you can snapshot add-ons. But the conclusion was it's going to be complicated.
Right. I guess Igor is what does PKG do with add-ons? And
well, yeah, native add-ons must be deloaded, like deload operation system call. So I guess they're tightly coupled to file system, so they must be picked up from the file system, real file system, not any sort of virtual one.
Right.
So PKG ended up with placing native modules nearby with shipped executable. Why? Because it's generally a practice to place DLL Windows libraries along with the executable that is shipped but requires those DLL libraries. So we can treat native modules actually the same way. Yeah.
Okay, so in that case, it wasn't a single binary, but some shared libraries that went along with them.
About native add-ons, we should probably talk with Anna, because Boxed Node apparently supports that.
Yeah, okay. It could be, it would be simpler if we're compiling all of Node at the same time, I think. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll add that as a note.
If you are compiling Node from source, then you're not looking for an additional section, because you would be using the existing process we have for compiling the call libraries into the directly into the executable. We know where those are, and I think that's how BoxNode does it. I think it adds things to the list of files to be converted into C and loaded into that array that we use.
So I guess that comes back to, there's kind of like two approaches. One is like a compile approaches. Compile into Node, and one is like bundle into existing. Because those will be two quite different approaches. We've talked through now the approach of if you want to use existing EXEs and be able to bundle something onto that, bundle onto existing. So I think maybe that's, yeah, one of the fundamental differences. Like box node takes the, I'm going to compile node, and as I compile, add extra things, like add in the application to the exe, and then the bundle onto the existing node is the other approach of like, hey, I already have an exe, how do I just tack something onto it? And I suppose each one will have its own advantages and disadvantages. Just want to go back to that other doc and just see the comment if we've covered the concepts or whatever that were mentioned in terms of there. Because we may have come back to similar, being not that far off from that suggestion there, which was like, got boot script, prelude size, prelude, payload position, bakery. Header starts with magic string, header size. Baked in Node.js command line, arguments, other stuff. I think that's, yeah. I think the main difference is like the suggestion there was like C++ routines that scan the executable for the header. I think we're talking about we should use like existing sections in the exe format, although I guess that's now platform specific versus generic, but. Any other, I think, I guess the question on so if we, I'm just thinking now if we have the two approaches, one like bundling onto an existing Node exe and compiling with the Node exe, I think we've come up with the sort of minimum useful thing that Node could do to help enable the bundling onto. The similar question might be to compile with Node, but maybe, you know, Anna probably, having done that work, has pretty good insight and may have already added the things to Node to enable that that approach. But we could ask her if there's things that are still needed in Node to facilitate that. I don't know if anybody else has any more thoughts on that or.
So I don't know if it was completely redundant, but there used to be I think it was called third-party main thing that Node used to look for and load if it found them. But I believe we took it out quite a long time ago. So I don't think it's there anymore.
Okay.
But I guess the question is, you know, how do you do that initial loading? Because as has been mentioned before, at the moment, Node will either load the REPL if no arguments are given, or will go through the existing sort of bootstrap code before loading the user JavaScript. So there used to be a mechanism to say instead of running, I can't even remember what the equivalent was because this was way before we reorganized things for the CJS bootloader and the ESM bootloader. But there was a sort of alternate loading path that Node used to support.
And that would be, sorry, go ahead.
Right. So, but I think that can be done. Like if you're going with looking for something in the binary to see if there is this section that we need to bootstrap from, then we can just add a condition because we have this function called start execution that looks at various command line flags and stuff to determine the entry point. So when the third party main was a thing, it was one of these conditions in that giant function. So to make the new entry point works, we just need to add another condition there to look for this section if and make sure that it's checked before other like REPL stuff is checked. And if this section is present, we just run from there and ignores other like REPL checking stuff. So I think that would already work.
I don't know, Richard, if you were thinking that was a requirement for the compile with Node versus the bundled onto Node one.
No, I only mentioned it because it's something we used to have that we took out because I think we deemed no one was using it.
Right.
At the time. It's just sort of prior art, and it may be completely superfluous or useless in this discussion, or maybe there are things we could look at when we used to have that in terms of those would be places that would have similar modifications.
Right. Okay. So it's good prior art to consider.
Yeah. I think that was a simpler mechanism compared to what we are trying to see if it's possible here, because to enable third-party main, it was pretty simple. You just check if there is this script called third-party main, and if it is there, then you run it and you stop looking for other execution modes. So if we do implement this more complicated section lookup mechanism, I think it will also work. It's just much more difficult to implement, so we didn't do that and provided third-party main instead, because that was just much simpler.
And I'm just thinking about something is in which mode do we run this new section? Should it be ESM or CommonJS or option somehow configurable?
So ESM,
because currently we use the it depends on the file extension or the package JSON, but here we are thinking about putting the JavaScript content there, so there's no file name to decide which kind of JS it is.
I guess that can be a configuration in this section.
Yeah, I think I added in the list above like an option, an options. So I think that could be another option, like that you're, ES6 or a standard JS or common JS.
Yeah, I think we probably only want to support these two types of startup mode. There are others, but I don't think they're going to be useful for this kind of use case. We can add more certainly if we want.
mean, that we could, I think like we're really just doing a bootstrap, right? So I think if people want to do more complicated things, we should defer them to generating whatever the code is from the data section, and then starting it in the right way. So I don't know if that bootstrap needs to support, like, I think that's kind of what Joy might have been saying, is like that doesn't need to support too many different options, because the packager could handle that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there are things that are part of the bootstrap, like loaders, and if you use the require option, -- require. Those are things that have to be run before the entry point of the application.
I think some of those then just won't work.
Or we will figure that out in later iterations, but they won't be supported in the first iteration.
Right, exactly, right? Like, we don't necessarily, I think there'd definitely be the caveat that you can't just use all node command line options. And only if it was like super important would we maybe figure some of those out.
I guess we can still support some of them. Like, for example, if you do want to do -- require, you can specify flag that takes no flags. And then you do -- require whatever there. If you want to start the bundle thing with additional required modules. I guess that will also work.
Okay, so I guess back to we're probably at the point in time where we've spent our time on this one, and maybe we should spend the last 20 minutes that we have on sort of next steps and actions. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we might as well grab the two. Let's start with this section since we just talked about this. So I know there was at least one ask, and still needed in Node.js to support compile with node approach. I think we would want to, like, there was Jessic had commented, it had been the one who'd commented what we discussed with Jessic with respect to discuss being I guess we're still like talk, reach out to V8 team to see if they would accept patch to allow up. What's that? I'm not typing it right, but it's like obfuscated code, right?
I think we can write to allow bytecode instead of source code.
Or like removing source code because bytecode is already there. It's just I think the patch was just trying to disable saving source code.
So to allow running bytecode without source.
Yes.
Right, okay. So basically it's for us to be able to say load this list, this bytecode, but don't give the source. I guess it's loading bytecode. Is that the APIs that were being changed?
I think the patch wasn't necessarily making sure that because like when you package that, you already have the bytecode available somehow. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was probably being confused. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I'm still trying to, is we think the change to V8 is to basically say, here's a list of bytecode we want to load and then run that bytecode, or is it something different?
I think it's already possible that
okay.
to save the bytecode and give it back, but we are still obligated to pass the source with it.
Okay.
Well, I think what the patch was trying to do is to ask V8 to not check because V8 checks if the code cache matches the source string. So what it does is ask patching V8 so that it doesn't check, and it just takes the code cache and run it. And the code cache contains bytecode.
Okay, I think I'm not quite sure how to write that down properly.
I agree with both Joey and Michael. There is a npm package called v8 compile cache that actually what it does is provides both source code and cache. v8 compile cache.
Okay, yep.
So that basically means asking V8 if they can rely on the cache instead of treating it as something that's possible to fail. So right now V8 still requires the source because they need it as the source of truth. The cache is kind of nice to have, but it's not something that you should rely on. So
right.
that's why it always requires the source.
Okay. So there's existing APIs to say, like if we use this npm v8 compile cache, it would give us a cache, which we could then load through existing APIs. But today V8 would fail because we haven't also used the APIs to load in the corresponding source. Is that?
Today you can pass it the cache, but you also need to patch the corresponding source, and V8 would check that the source matches the cache, even though it's a very simple check. It just check the length matches, but so you can totally just generate a dump like a gibberish with the same length, but to bypass the check. But right now V8 requires you that to passing the original source, because it doesn't assume that the cache can be the only source of truth, because it's just a cache.
Okay.
But does it actually work if you don't pass the source? I mean, what happens if you try to open it in with the inspector and add a breakpoint?
It probably would crash or just stop working. But if you only want it to compile and run, it doesn't really need a source. But
okay. Also for the stack traces, that's fine.
Yeah, I suppose that would be fine, because you only need the line number and that kind of metadata, which is already part of the functions function info, that the shared function info that we save into the memory. So yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, and I think if you don't want the source to be there, then like not being able to debug and not getting stack traces with that's what you want anyway, right?
I think stack traces will still be available because you don't need the source for that. But
what will function that toString return in that case?
Wait, I think we still need to we still process the source when generating.
It considers all functions native. It's like
right.
Okay, so it works. It will not make the application crash if.
No, and the stack traces will be a 0, 0 in worst case. So 0 line, 0 character in the line. So yeah. I mean not the stack trace, but the call site, so-called. But yeah, unfortunately it's not possible to map, as far as I remember, to map the place. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to reparse the source to get the source positions for errors. It has, I think it has positions in the memory, but it's not totally reliable. They need to do some additional parsing to generate the stack trace. So yeah, for that they still need the source.
I'm wondering though, like, okay, so if we have our bootstrap script, we could make the calls to say, okay, let's load it with the way that doesn't provide the source. For the things that then get loaded later on, is that going to just work if they don't have the source? I mean, because like you do a require, and the virtual file system, will it be able to? Like, I'm wondering how that not having source for the rest of the things works.
There additional patches are required for sure. What Joey was talking about, we must say to V8, like, take it easy that there is no source code, relied on the cache alone. In addition to few more patches that JSCC mentioned, is that, for example, we disable doing anything related to source code, like I can't recall it, flush, something like flush. It requires all the in short, all the places that V8 assumes source code to be around must be stopped, blocked, disabled, returned early.
Right. But I guess even so that part I can understand. I was also starting to worry about, though, like we have this data section which is passed, or even that E, like we're talking about passing the bootstrap code through the -E. That may be regular code. That may be like code with source code, because maybe that's okay, because that's just being bundled in here. but then eventually that needs to start running some JavaScript, which you don't want to have the source for. How does that JavaScript get loaded?
Well, as far as I understand, it's the same approach as V8 compile cache package. So it's not necessary to be on the file system. I'm sure you can fit all the bundled assets and JavaScript files and the JavaScript and the corresponding V8 cache for those JavaScript files, everything inside the -e thing.
Okay. So basically that's all of the JavaScript that's going to be run. And then the data is just like files and resources and stuff like that.
Yeah, the only obstacle is further to disable JavaScript and use cache alone.
Right, okay. Okay, got it. Okay, so that's, we'd reach out to the V8 team.
Right, actually, I realized that I discussed about it with Yang at one point when he was still on the V8 team, and there was apparently a prior art, and he said it was doable. So but he isn't on the V8 team now, so that might still be subject to whoever the owner is thinks. But yeah, I suppose it's more. It's actually like something that's possible to be done.
Okay.
In VA. I've pasted the patch into the chat.
Okay, that just didn't land for some reason.
Right, it seems to be stalled just.
Okay.
So it might be worth it to pick it up again.
Right, okay. Oh, you added in, sorry. I didn't notice that. That's good, right. Just gonna reorder a little bit. Let me move that. Oop. Okay, any other things we should write up as sort of next steps? Those are the sort of concrete ones I can think of. And then of course, this would capture what we think, a path of what would add value. Then it's always a matter of, finding people who are interested to help move it forward and that kind of stuff. But having that documented would be a good first step. Okay, so unless there's anything else on that one, we can move over to doing the same for the types discussion. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm going to put that down here. I think the first one is starting discussion of adopting Electron style guide. Document. I think it'd also be good to document our target flow. Like I think everybody was in agreement that the sort of split between what the node project does and what is done externally in projects like definitely types made sense. But I think documenting and capturing that somewhere in the node project makes sense to me. It seemed like, you know, the Electron style guide was a good initial step that might help us get to something more structured that would make it easier for consumption. And further explore Electron types parser can be used to generate I think, Michael, you mentioned that it would be useful to move the metadata into Markdown regardless of this. Is that right?
I don't know if it would be useful, but I would like that to happen because currently you have to, if you are just looking at the docs on GitHub, you have to open the source code to see them. It's not rendered.
Okay. Any other things from the discussion that people think we should sort of call out as the things to sort of next concrete steps?
Maybe rethink a bit how the documentation is structured between the API documentation and the other things like we talked about, I think, how the packages work.
Right. Okay.
Which have nothing to do with types, and we don't need that to be written according to the Electron style guide.
Right. So should the API doc and the other topics be more separated or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like for example, I know like the Node API stuff, it's actually really, I guess, the JavaScript API docs, right?
Yes.
Maybe that's what we're talking about here, is like if it was the JavaScript API docs and then the rest of the docs, which could include, you know, generic topics or some of the things we do document in terms of C++. Okay, yeah, that's a good one. Any other things? Okay, well, I've noticed we're 3 minutes over our time, so you know, feel free if you think of other things to add them in terms of those next steps. Otherwise, I'll say a big thank you for everybody who's participated, and particularly for everybody who lasted the whole time. I think this was, at least from my perspective, really interesting and helps to to give us some good ideas of what we could do on these two topics. So anybody have anything else they want to add before we close out?
Well, just thank you for driving the conversation.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and we'll talk again soon.